Barely Sapient here. Today we're going to take another look at CachyOS. Now, while it did not make sense on aging NVIDIA hardware, does it make sense on an AMD APU? Well, today we're going to find out. Now, does CachyOS make sense on an AMD APU from the AM4 era? That it's not quite as old as the NVIDIA hardware I tested before, but it's not exactly brand new either. Well, to find out, I used my laptop and tested it. Now, it has an AMD Ryzen 7 5700U, and that comes with AMD Radeon graphics, Vega 8 graphics, that is. This system also has 32 gigs of DDR4 32 megahertz RAM, as well as a 1 terabyte NVMe SSD. I tested Cyberpunk 2077 at 720p, and for the graphics setting I use AMD FSR 3.0. I set the setting on FSR to performance. Frame generation, of course, is off, and this is basically the low preset with a couple of things changed. I went ahead and put the crowd density to medium because this is an AMD Ryzen 5700U. The CPU should be fairly okay with that. The other thing that I lowered down is anisotropy to 1. And all other settings are low or off, with the exception of color precision. That only has medium and high. So Cyberpunk 2077 in Linux Mint isn't even playable according to the in-game benchmark, as it only gets an average frame rate of 28.1 frames per second. Not a good sign. In CachyOS, using this hardware, Cyberpunk 2077 at least puts out something that looks like it might be playable in the in-game benchmark at 31.15 frames per second. So it's better. Cyberpunk 2077's in-game benchmark is a great tool for determining which PC is faster, or in this case, which OS is faster on the same hardware. So this is in CachyOS, and I'm in the middle of the city, and I'm about to start Chaos. And as you can see, the frame rate, it actually holds up. It seems to be playable at these settings. That's pretty good, considering. Now, this is, of course, if you consider around 30 frames per second playable. It's not going to be the best experience, but it is playable by that metric. In Linux Mint, at the same settings, and when I try to start Chaos, I get a cinematic frame rate instead. It's not really that playable. It's a much worse experience than CachyOS. So when I try to get the game to run in Linux Mint, God of War, anyway, I first started with the latest Proton Glorious Egg Roll version, and I go to try to start the game, and it tells me that it's launching, and it just doesn't run. So when I go to try say another version of Proton, I tried some previous versions that worked on other machines, like say GE Proton 927. And for whatever reason, I get the same result each time. It says that it's launching, and then it goes to playing, and then it immediately stops. It just doesn't launch. I tried this with a number of versions of Proton, and the result each time has been the same thing. I tried the wine Glorious Eggroll Wine version, and I start to launch it as well. It gives me this little configuration thing that it's doing. It's updating, right? And then it just doesn't launch. Nothing so far on my laptop has worked. Maybe there is a version that would. But out of the box, on this hardware, getting this game to run in Linux Mint, certainly not easy, and I was not able to do it because I just didn't want to spend the time doing it, I suppose. So just not user-friendly in that regard. It's weird because I've been able to get God of War to work in Linux Mint on other hardware, quite easily in fact. But on this hardware, not so much. Okay, so on this hardware I was able to get God of War to work in CachyOS by selecting Proton CachyOS. By using those settings in Wine, the game launches. I was unable to do this in Linux Mint, so that's a huge win for CachyOS. In Linux Mint, I don't have access to Proton CachyOS's versions of Proton in Heroic Games Launcher. And I wonder if that would help. Something to think about. In every Linux distro, there's always a chance that there's a workaround. What do I mean by that? Well, let's see. If I go into, I'm in Linux Mint here. If I go to the software manager and I look up Proton, something that comes up is this Proton Plus. Now I already have this installed, but you can find it in the software manager, right? And then what I did is I opened Proton Plus, and what you can do is when you open Proton Plus, you can download different versions of Proton, and you can apply it to either Steam or Heroic Games Launcher. You can switch it up here, and guess what? Proton CachyOS is available to download for both Steam and Heroic Games Launcher. And I'm running Linux Mint. This is pretty cool for Proton Plus. It's a great little feature here. Now let's see if I can get God of War to run with Proton CachyOS in Linux Mint. Okay, so here I am in Heroic Games Launcher at God of War. I'm going to go to Wine. I've already downloaded Proton CachyOS. Let's see if I can get it to work. I'll select one of them there. Looks like I downloaded two of them. And we'll see, right? I was not able to get it to work with other versions of Proton. So this should be interesting. So I've selected that. Let's see if it goes. Let's see if it actually launches. It may take a while. Nope. Well, it was a shot in the dark. Worth a shot, right? Well, still can't get it to launch in Linux Mint. However, the game does work in CachyOS. The thing about God of War is if you go to the settings and you go to display, there's only two display modes, borderless and windowed. If you switch to windowed, you can't have full screen. You can get close to it. That's going to be a little annoying. And not the best way to play, right? It's kind of, most people like to play their games in full screen. The problem is, when you go to full screen by switching to borderless, you can only set the render scale for the internal resolution to 50%. That's as far down as you can go. So the most I can set this down to is 540p. And on this game, on this hardware, in this OS, 540p is not quite low enough to be playable. So at 1080p with the resolution scaling at 50%, which is the lowest possible, and the lowest possible settings, which is the best possible situation for this. It's just not playable at any time the game is demanding. Like this, the first boss fight, it's below 30 frames per second. The response time is just not good, not quite there. In order to get the game to be playable on this system in CachyOS, I changed the display configuration in the OS. You can right click anywhere on the desktop, open the display configuration, and I changed it to 800 by 600, and then I went down to the bottom and changed the scaling to scale by the system, as opposed to allow the applications, this is the other option, to scale themselves. That's important with a game like God of War because it seems to really like that control on its own. Then when I went back in game, I went to settings, I went to display, and you can see the maximum output resolution is now 800 by 600. And I can set this render scale to lower, down to 50%, and this is how I got it to be playable. That does mean though that the ultimate internal resolution scale that's being rendered, the resolution that's being rendered, is only 400 by 226. That's pretty low. Now at these settings the game is playable. The resolution is low and you can tell, especially when it's blown up for a YouTube video. On my 15-inch laptop screen, the graphics were okay. The gameplay, the controls were responsive enough to make it enjoyable to play. The graphics, yeah, not so great, but still definitely playable. That's amazing for something that doesn't meet the minimum system requirements for this game. Grand Theft Auto 5 is no doubt one of the most popular games ever created, and the enhanced version is highly optimized and actually runs on the Radeon Vega 8 graphics. So let's see how it performs in CachyOS versus Linux Mint. In both operating systems I tested at 1080p, and I used the low settings and didn't really touch anything in those settings, and so it's just the low settings in game. To benchmark Grand Theft Auto 5 in both CachyOS and Linux Mint, I played about 2 minutes and went around and tried to cause as much havoc as I could, and the results were, in Linux Mint the average frame rate was 38.8 frames per second. The 1% low was 28.9, the 0.1% low was 16.6. In CachyOS, the average frame rate was 41.6 frames per second, the 1% low was 32.9, and the 0.1% low was 32.4. So in CachyOS, the average and especially the lows were higher. Rise of the Tomb Raider on this hardware favors 720p low settings. So I tested the game's in-game benchmark in both Linux Mint and CachyOS. Now Linux Mint can run both the Linux port and a Proton version of Rise of the Tomb Raider, while CachyOS for some reason is incompatible with the Linux port, so that's unusual. Okay, so when I tried to run the Linux port in CachyOS, it just won't launch. Now it'll launch into the menu just fine, just like every other time you launch the game. And this is the menu that's brought up by the Linux port. It's a little different than the Windows one. But once I press play on that dialog box, this is as far as it gets. It says it's running, never actually loads the game. In Linux Mint, the frame rate on Proton happened to be an overall score of about 42 frames per second. The lows do dip into the 20s. In Linux Mint, using the Linux port, the overall score is higher as it's almost 49 frames per second, but the lows are concerning. To get Rise of the Tomb Raider to run in CachyOS, I had to pick one of the Protons, and of course I'm going to pick the CachyOS Proton because they tend to work better in CachyOS. Makes sense, right? In CachyOS, using Proton CachyOS, Rise of the Tomb Raider, the benchmark is almost at 44 frames per second, but again the lows are concerning. Although playing in-game seems almost indistinguishable from playing in Linux Mint at the same settings. So, I mean, this game, well, I can't exactly call this a win for CachyOS or Linux Mint, really. The performance on the in-game benchmark favors Mint when using the Linux port, although Proton in Mint is, well, a lot slower. And it's still playable in Proton CachyOS, but this is by no means a win for CachyOS in this game. In both Linux Mint and CachyOS, I tested Total War Warhammer at 1080p low. So let's see what happens when I try to load Total Warhammer in CachyOS using the Linux native port. Okay, as usual, it'll bring up the dialog box and with a little warning saying your distro isn't supported. That's normal. Doesn't mean it'll work or won't work. Doesn't matter. Let's see if it'll launch into game though. Yeah, it warns me again. Interesting. Yep, launches into the game just fine. So, yeah, that's the weird thing about Linux ports. They'll work in most distros, but sometimes they just won't work. But this time it worked. So, in the in-game benchmark, the Linux port in CachyOS averaged 42.4 frames per second, and it looks like there was only one dip that got possibly lower than 30. So it did pretty well. Now it's time to see what happens if I use Proton in CachyOS. So I'm going to change the compatibility and force Proton CachyOS, the Steam Linux runtime package, and go from there. Now it will make you update when you do this. Unfortunately, when you change versions from the Linux port to a Proton version in Total War Warhammer, it's quite a substantial download. It's about 17 gigabytes, so yeah, it takes a while, unfortunately. Just like Rise of the Tomb Raider, the launch dialog box that you get in Proton is the same that you would get in Windows. It's different than the one you get in Linux. In the in-game benchmark, the Dwarfs vs. Greenskins benchmark, CachyOS does terrible in Proton. Wow. Frame rate is cut almost to a third of what it was in the Linux port. Interesting. What was interesting is that on Bazite and Linux Mint, this game worked better on an NVIDIA card using Proton than it did using the Linux port. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Linux Mint here on the Radeon Vega 8. Now this is footage from the in-game benchmark, and it looks like so far the Linux port is doing a pretty good job of maintaining above 30 frames per second at this point. But we shall see. So the Linux port does better in CachyOS, as here in Linux Mint the average is 39.7 and there are dips into the mid-20s. Okay, so this is footage from the in-game benchmark in Linux Mint using Proton, and it looks like it's struggling as well. The Linux port works better than Proton on this hardware, it looks like. Yeah, the numbers bear that out. It's also about 16 frames per second as it was in CachyOS, and so Proton is just not the right way to go on this hardware, it looks like. Now in Proton on this game there is another option. You do not necessarily have to run it in DirectX 11. You can also run DirectX 12 on this game. So maybe I should try that out and see how that works on this hardware. Because DX11, yeah, 16 frames per second on at the in-game benchmark, that's really, really low. The Linux port just crushes it at that point. So I'm going to select the launch options to DirectX 12. Maybe this will be better performance. We shall see. No dice. DX12 in Proton is just as slow as DX11 in Proton in Linux Mint. So there was no advantage doing that. 16.2 frames per second seems to be what this game will run at in Proton. Doesn't matter if it's DX11 or 12. So I'm back in CachyOS. Let's see what happens if I set Total War Warhammer to DirectX 12 in this version of Proton. This is footage running CachyOS Proton and CachyOS and DX12, and yeah, it seems to be again locked at 16 frames per second in this footage. And again, it's at, well, this time 16.5 frames per second. Yeah, I suppose with this game on this hardware in Linux, use the Linux port. So Skyrim is another popular game, and Skyrim Special Edition, although older, is still challenging to AM4 APUs at 1080p. To benchmark Skyrim Special Edition in both OSs, I picked a fight with the guards in Falkreath because it was a rainy day. So in both distros, I set the resolution to 1080p, anti-aliasing, to FXAA, and it was basically 1080p medium settings. At these settings, I picked a fight, and in Linux Mint, the average frame rate ended up being 34.1 frames per second. The 1% low was 29.6 frames per second, and the 0.1% low was 19.4 frames per second. Now the controls felt a bit slow to respond. In CachyOS, with the same settings, the same place, the same guards, I picked a fight, and the frame rate ended up being 32.1 frames per second. The 1% low was 27.8 frames per second, and the 0.1% low was 23.1 frames per second. Now the controls did feel more responsive in this, and I think it was that 0.1% low that made the difference. So in CachyOS you could probably get away with these settings. In Linux Mint you're going to have to either lower the resolution or lower the settings to at least low, and that would be the difference. So on this hardware, CachyOS had either better numbers, felt smoother during gameplay, or both, except in one game, and that was Rise of the Tomb Raider. For older or lower end hardware in Linux, the Linux port is the better choice if you can run it, because it'll run better. Unfortunately, CachyOS, it doesn't work, and so it had worse performance in this game. And for whatever reason, God of War wouldn't even launch in Linux Mint on this hardware, and it was fully playable, albeit at a very low resolution in CachyOS. So, if you have a laptop or mini PC with an AM4 APU, CachyOS makes a lot of sense if you want to use Linux. Like and subscribe if you like the video, and comments are always welcome.